こんにちは。明治学院大学の服部です。今日はですね、今我々はオックスフォードという、イギリスのオックスフォードの、からですね、車で30分ぐらい行ったウッドストックというところにいます。ウッドストックにですね、なぜ来たのかというと、オックスフォード大学で教えていらっしゃるですね、フォーカス先生に取材をしに来ているからです。フォーカス先生は非常に日本の東京とかも含めてですね、世界中の都市について、非常に研究されて高い見識をお持ちなので、今回この都市の魅力はどういうものであるのかとかですね、なぜ今人々は郊外を捨てて都心に向かっていくのか、特に若い人たちのですね、この、行動形態っていうのはですね、どういう都市を執行するのかっていうのは変わってきてますから、そういう、ことについてですね、聞いていきたいと思います。
Well, let's perhaps start off thinking about what created cities in the first place, more than 3,000 years, more, even possibly much more than that. It is that proximity of interactions which is possible in a city, which makes things more efficient. And ultimately possible, whereby dispersed living makes that unwieldy, difficult, and not as immediate. So what will people be wanting in a city? They want to be able to share activities, they want to be able to share interactions and have them all quickly and have them all rapidly without having to spend time waiting to go from one place to another. Furthermore, there is one added element, which is that of the group. The group. In a city, it's possible to have group activity, group interaction, whereby in a rural environment that is not so easily. And hence, cities have always been at the forefront of social and intellectual change. So I would imagine now, like in times in the past, this is what makes people want to be in close proximity to each other, hence being in a city environment.
But especially in late 1960s till late 1980s maybe, people dispersed from the city to suburbs. They thought city was not a good place to live, and they want to have more low density maybe. So why was that happen? Why is it now turning backwards again?
Well, let's have a look a little bit at the dynamics of cities. One of the issues of cities has been that close proximity is also at times can be an issue of a marker of social class, a marker of wealth. So, for instance, Friedrich Engels has written a wonderful description of the city of Manchester more than 100 years ago, and how the inner suburbs, or the inner city, had to be shielded off so that the wealthy people coming from outside would not come in contact or see that. I think in the 60s, in many cities in Europe and especially in the United States, there was that idea that the center of the city had been now populated by poor people, by people that they would have rather wished to differentiate themselves from, and building outside in the suburbs was a possibility that now became quite possible because car travel had become relatively cheaper. So with cheaper building methods, houses in the suburbs were typically built at much lower cost per square meter, as it were, than other houses, and now it was possible even for a lower middle class to aspire to having space and be away from poverty or other elements of the city that they would have not wished to have seen.
Well, your explanation really fits to most of the American cities, but how about in Europe? Was it similar as well? Like I kind of like because I'm not from Europe, I kind of see like some of the Latin cities, like Italian cities, or maybe like some cities in like Spain. They have a tendency to like have high density in the middle and not really so poor. Maybe some rich area as well. But can you explain a little bit about these European cities' difference?
Okay,
Yeah.
let's talk.
Okay,
European cities, again, one has to differentiate both between size and between countries in different stages of development.
Okay.
So you mentioned Spain, and you could look at much of southern Europe in that respect. The 1960s were different from what they would have been in the United Kingdom or in the United States of America. A lower level of wealth and a massive immigration from the countryside, which didn't occur in those. So a lot of poorer people are coming into the city looking for the first time to establish housing. And here, to make it cheaper, housing was at much higher densities. That suburbanization process takes place a little bit later in the southern Europe than what we've seen it in northern Europe. So we see that now taking place in the 1980s and 1990s, whereby, again, different type of suburbs are being built further away. Car travel now become also cheaper and affordable to a wider section of society. But in northern Europe, we have seen, again, different type of suburbs that were created, for instance, in London, much earlier, at the end of the 19th century, with the expansion of the underground system, whereby led by large developers who would have also financed the construction of the underground extensions. And also, so the interesting thing about that was these suburbs were originally created not to be used by the car, but were based on public transport. The suburbs from the 1930s on, they are the first ones now that houses have garages attached to them. The suburbs of the late Victorian era will all have no parking space at all. Hence, a big problem becomes, as people have cars, where do they park their cars? And a problem of these high-density suburbs is an issue.
Okay. So, but now people seems to like get away from suburbs to city center again. Even though the car is much more convenient, it may be more affordable than they used to. And how do you explain these kind of phenomena? And it seems to be going on everywhere. I mean, not in like developing country, but
the car brings its problems. The car is great if you're the only person who has one. But if everybody has a car, it just means you're stuck in a traffic jam for hours. So possibly a victim of the success of the system then has meant that these cities now get terribly congested in terms of cars. So if you're living in a far-flung suburb, you're spending hours on your commuting or any other type of journey stuck in traffic jams. That, combined with a number of other reasons we can talk about, leads to a sort of decline of the appeal of the suburb. So, again, and perhaps there's always been a premium to live closer to the center. So if we look at all cities, prices of land and housing are greater the way closer we get to the city. Tokyo is a good example to look at that for the economic side, is that after the burst of the bubble, land prices dropped and house prices dropped in the center, meaning that people who somehow were forced to the suburbs due to high land values can now start thinking about relocating closer to their workplaces, spending less amount of wasted time traveling to and from crowded trains, which are also victims of their success as well as the roads.
Okay, wow. But it also seems like you mentioned that this suburb has much less appeal than they used to. But what was like the appeal of suburb to begin with, and why did it like kind of not disappear, but it has been diminished?
Well, perhaps it'd be interesting to turn a little bit our attention to how our young people seeing cities.
Oh, okay.
So, mentioned a generation ago would have wanted to live in the suburb, would have wanted to have a car, a good car, a social status symbol would have been their car. Now, a generation growing up in the suburbs realizes its limitations. The young people, as they grow up, unable to drive initially, will find themselves stuck. They cannot go and visit places so much. The suburbs are located not in areas that allow great social interaction. And these people grow up with a sense, perhaps it is not so great. Perhaps what is really great is getting on your skateboard and going to the cafe to meet your friends. They might view their parents' mobility as something terribly old-fashioned. They will think of, well, you know, my parents, they get in the car to visit their friends, they get stuck in traffic jams, then they spend hours trying to find parking, eventually they get there, and that just seems wasted time and old-fashioned. So they might just think it's cooler, it's easier to get on public transport, to go by bicycle, something that doesn't fit with that status that the parents would have had. I think for many young people, the status symbol is not showing off, you know, the latest Honda car that has come out, but perhaps the latest iPhone that has come out. And that's differentiating themselves. And perhaps also we should be thinking, are younger people seeing their mobility also different? Are they valuing instant mobility greater than longer taking time physical mobility? So is it more important to be able to Snapchat with your friends at any moment rather than getting into a car and driving somewhere for an experience?
That's very interesting. So the British young people are losing interest in cars generally. Is that
Well, in Great Britain, car travel has been going down for a large number of years, nearly about a decade or more. Car travel has been falling, which is a little bit bewildering in terms of what professionals had been expecting, because they'd been expecting car travel inevitably to rise and roads continuously to being built. And yet something's changing. Young people especially, and more interestingly, young men are giving up driving.
young men?
Very low taking up of driving licenses, which is very, very different to what would be expected at least a generation ago.
Definitely. Well, this is interesting because this is also the case in Japan. Japanese young people tend not to want to have license, even though many of them live in suburbs. And if you don't have a driver license, that would be a quite big limitation living in suburbs. But some college students, they were like really you have to force them, or their parents have to force them to take driver license. And this is...
Yes. I think there could be a number of explanations for this. One is that these people have grown up being driven all the time by their parents.
Being driven.
So now they reach their 20s, they still in that perhaps infantile mode where they'll say, "Mummy, can you please drive me to my friend?" Which a generation ago would have been too embarrassed to even say. And coming back to that cultural thing, I was talking to a middle-aged friend in Washington, D.C., and I was saying, when you were young, if a young man came and asked to take you out on a date, would you ever go if he was to take you on a date with public transit? And she said, oh, goodness, no. And yet, this is what is happening now. So what would have been seen as an impossible to go out on a date without a car, now is a de rigueur thing. You will meet up with people socially in wine bars, in cafes, and you'll not be expected to drive there. Certainly, there are no more any drive-in cinemas to go to as there were in the 1960s. So again, that car culture is changing, and here it becomes interesting. What is changing? Is it the car culture that is changing? The urban renaissance that is happening? Which is leading which? Is it young people no longer wanting to spend hours and expense driving to wanting an urban environment where the car is no longer an option? There are many other factors, at least in Europe, we should take into account. The young people now is possibly the first generation that is poorer than their parents.
Yes.
So people are studying longer. There is, in many countries, high youth unemployment. In places like Greece and Spain, it's over 50% of the population. So we're having much poorer, younger people studying more, in which case possibly spending all that amount of money on having a car seems either impossible or a misallocation of resources. It's a huge ground. Everything is. This is landscape, very famous British landscape.
Many of these cities is much better in terms of physical environment than 20 years ago or maybe 10 years ago. And London, I suppose I have this impression that it wasn't really as a good place to be. I mean, it's still a very fascinating. It was still a fascinating city, but this environment has become much improved. And what kind of like triggered the city to have this kind of better environment?
It's interesting you asked that question, because London is quite striking how different it has been. And here perhaps there's something to be said about some world-class cities that differ from others. So it will be interesting to compare London, let's say, to Birmingham and see, is it the same thing that's happening? In my view, the world-class cities have been able to attract a lot of wealth and capital from around the world. You will see the same thing in New York, for instance, whereby all that wealth and capital have led to huge increases in prices of accommodation, which has meant the poorer, somehow inner city areas that were derelict, that were the place where poor people lived, where there was crime, are pushed out. So now we, in my view, in places like London, we see that poverty, that dereliction moved away from the inner city, which has been gentrified, and they're pocketed in areas of the suburbs. We see this very much in Paris. So it is interesting in Paris when you see that there are riots or anything, it's never in the city of the center, it is in these ghettoized suburbs. In New York, we see this very much with a massive decline in crime, and again pushed out. And yet, to some lesser extent, we see it in all cities. But I think these world-class cities have set themselves at a level apart, creating this special type of situation, built with enormous inflow of wealth from all over the world.
It seems like now the bigger city seems to be really kind of like winning. I understand there's a lot of people attracted to London or Paris in certain cases, maybe not as strong as London, but and also Tokyo. So I was just asking myself if there's any limits to this economic scale to the city.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, again, it's a fascinating question, because what we're seeing about these big cities is how they are transmogrifying. In many cases, they're no longer a single city. We're talking about mega city developments. So if we look at the east coast of America, really it's a city that starts from Boston and ends in Washington. You will get airports such as Baltimore advertising that they are the airport of Washington. And ultimately, to some respects, they've got a good train service that will lead you, might be even better than going to Dallas, for instance. But then development is happening. And I think as these cities are expanding, it's also unclear a bit as to where is the city. Take an example, London. London is usually viewed by the eyes of the tourists, who will just circle a tiny little part of that central area. But here we are in Oxford, and we have a small airport, which changed its name 2 years ago to the London Oxford Airport. So we're moving at distances whereby that city is expanding, and in the wider region. So perhaps we're no longer looking at cities just as that core of the city, as important as culturally, economically, historically it may be, but also now the region is taking a greater importance. In which case, what becomes interesting is to see how are the regional centers within that much wider metropolis developing, and how are the suburbs declining, how the regional centers reinvigorating themselves or creating themselves.
If you're giving advice to some of the mayor in like Japan, and he asks you how to reinvent my city, of course it depends on what kind of resource city they have, but what would be like your general advice if the mayor wants to reinvent their city? What he should start with, or
taking away the economics side of it, because a city that's not underpinned by proper economics will not work. But one thing that I would say would be absolutely cardinal importance, especially now, especially for young people, especially for the type of innovative, entrepreneurial young people that will add value, will be that urban environment. How attractive is that urban environment? A classical problem that occurs in this is, and has to do, in this case, with the car, is traditionally many of these cities have been seen as the car as vital to them. And yet the car can be a big barrier in that it creates places full of traffic, unfriendly to pedestrians, unfriendly to people walking around, unfriendly to shoppers, unfriendly ultimately to business, even if it's not seen like that. As you know, Curitiba is a good example where the mayor wanted to pedestrianize the main street, was not allowed, did it illegally overnight, and yet eventually it set out that center of Curitiba as being one of the most dynamic and pleasant places as the cities of the whole of Brazil. So public spaces which are attractive, which are walkable, which are cyclable, which are safe, should be any mayor's top priority in terms of attracting, building that environment whereby people want to be there, where things can happen. I think an old style of building a multi-story car park and getting some big corporation to set up an office block. No, that would just be, please try and avoid that.
Is there a consensus among most of the planners or urban designers in Europe? Or?
To some extent there is. It may be more so with academic planners than with city planners, but there is also terribly a mismatch of what old-style mayors and old-style policymakers think. And I think it has to do, again, with the generation. That generation that lived in the suburbs, that the dream was the car, that they get up on a Saturday and polish the car and go underneath and fix things, to the younger generation that is wanting more instant and access and mobility. I think there is a mismatch. The mayors and many of the city policymakers tend to be of the older generation, and in which case there can be a policy gap, as it were, between what younger people are wanting, where greater value is, but where the idea and the concept of how we should be living and what is good belongs to an older generation.
That is interesting. So what really changed this young generation's mindset from when? I mean, it must be some... Did it gradually change or...
Well, we've been seeing that. I mean, one classical thing is to see when car driving started to fall. So Lee Shipper and Adam Millard Paul about 15 years ago wrote a paper saying, hey, something is happening. Car travel is going down. What's going on? And then we started looking at, well, yes, and how are young people relating? Soon we figure out that it's young people that are causing this. And then we're seeing, well, what is happening? Why are they changing? And here there are a lot of interesting and attitudinal stuff, and also looking at seeing how it ties in with technology, with communications, and also with other values, more interestingly. And here it would be interesting to look at it more sociologically. How are people seeing work? So a generation ago, the salaryman having a good salary job was the objective of any young person and any young person's family.
That's a Europe thing.
Europe and Japan.
And Japan. Yes, we understand.
And in Europe.
Okay, Europe as well. Okay.
So, but now young people are interested in interesting experiences, work experiences. Many women will wish part-time jobs that will allow them to raise a family and work. The idea of going into a corporation and staying for your whole life seems really old-fashioned, if not really unpleasant, because it forbids you to gain greater life experiences. So when we're seeing attitudes to work are changing, this may be that perhaps in many places, possibly more outside Japan, work is becoming much less secure. So no one is being given a lifelong contract. People are being given 1 and 2 year contracts, in which case they have to change their mindset. Or it is that actually people are changing and valuing this. And to also, for many very young people, the impossibility, certainly at the moment in Europe, of getting a job. So in which case, what do you do if you're living in a country hit by recession, over 10 years? How do you fill in that work or non-work experience that you have. But again, social values and things changing together with mobility and urban values, all in a state of interesting flux at the moment.
Wow.
Many researchers are asking themselves not what is happening now, which they can see, but what will happen in the future. They'll say, when this young generation will have children, which they are postponing, having much later than the previous generation, what will they do? Will they too look for suburban type, salaryman type living?
Yes.
Will their experiences that they've gained up to now lead them to want different type of solutions? So when this generation goes into middle age, an interesting question is, how will the urban form suit them? Will they want to live in retrofitted suburbs, or will they want, again, that high quality urban, walkable, cyclable city available to them?
So I would like to ask you a last question. So you understand about Tokyo quite a lot, So is there any advice in terms of planning of Tokyo, what they should do?
I wouldn't want to say what you should do, but what I could say is that what makes places attractive globally that would also benefit Tokyo, I'd say apart from the economics of it, which it has to be able to stand, there's got to be industry that works, that is relevant and so on, is creating those urban areas which are attractive. So, for instance, the elevated roads going over canals and in between tight houses are no longer considered particularly good or attractive, but creating open spaces which are attractive to walk to, attractive to cycle to, attractive to be in without fear of being run over by a car or whatever, those are going to make the place stand out. And whether that works in Tokyo, I don't know, Tokyo is such a big place, and where would you locate these is an issue, but having great urban environments is what I would say is going to push Tokyo, a place to where people want to be.
Good.
Okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you.